Hey kids, the following program, although edited, contains scenes of sexuality, graphic violence,
ritual satanic behavior,
supernatural, explicit sequences. We're all familiar with them. Some material may be unsuitable for people unaccustomed to viewing films so explicitly presented.
Only you can judge if you're mature enough to witness the frank and revealing scenes.
They wish to consider whether it should be viewed by under 17.
Parental discretion is advised.
Cheers, you sexy beasts. Welcome to another episode of the Midnight Movie Mixtape. Tonight, we're going to be waxing nostalgic and talking about all sorts of vampire movies in honor of Dead and Lovely presumably embarking on yet another year of No Vampire, which is their November event where they review vampire films. I've been revisiting a lot of their old episodes lately, and I listened to the first two No Vampire seasons pretty much back to back, and it just got me kind of fired up to talk about favorite vampire films again. This is something I think I did like a year or two back for Cinemalog on my personal channel. I don't remember if the stream actually happened or if I just prepped all of it and then like tried to get people involved in it and nothing ever came of it, or if I just rolled out with it solo. I don't know. I can't find the video anywhere, so I'm assuming I think I just prepped it and then never got around to actually shooting it. So that's kind of a good thing because it allows me to do it for you guys here on the Schlockaholics channel and, you know, kind of inspire some of you guys out there and make your own favorite vampire lists. Now, I guess we should probably add a little disclaimer here at the beginning of this. But first, I'm going to sip on some of this delicious ice-cold Dos Equis. I've only ever had these a couple of times in my life, this being the second, and I don't hate them. I think I'd rather have a Corona or a Modelo or any other cerveza. Even a Tecate, I think I prefer to a Dos Equis, but these aren't bad. It's like good dinner beer. If you're to sit down at a Mexican restaurant and enjoy a sizzling plate of fajitas or something like that, I think a Dos Equis would pair with it nicely. So down the gullet, and then we're going to get you that disclaimer and get into our films here. So I've never been a gigantic fan of vampires as creatures. I've never been a huge devotee to the subgenre or anything like that. I don't dig on a lot of vampire fiction. And it's simply because, you know, outside of like some cool atmosphere with the early vampire films and Christopher Lee being badass, I don't find a ton interesting about the idea of vampires. You know, they're old, they suck blood, they have sexy powers or whatever. They can transform into a bat and flit around. That's fine and everything. I've just always been more interested in like actual monsters. Or people that transform into actual monsters, like a werewolf. So I guess the short and skinny of it is I've always been a werewolf kid. That said, though, it's hard to deny the atmosphere that I've already mentioned that comes along with certain vampire films. When done correctly, I think a vampire film should have like a great cast of recognizable or enjoyable characters, some cool effects, and preferably some cool gimmick. Maybe gimmick's the wrong word. Something new that they do with the idea of vampires, because the old classic shit has been done to death. And I think that unless you're going to pay homage to that and do something a little different or do what was done in the past really well, there's really no point in making a vampire movie because they're just folks what suck blood, right? But I could totally see why someone would structure a vampire marathon around the month of November, because when I think of ghouls and critters, creepy critters that feast, you know, the first thing I think about is those vampires, baby, because they do feast on the humans and their blood, right? So I have compiled a list of what I think most people would consider pretty decent vampire films. There's some absolute greats in here that are like obvious picks for most people. And then there's some that might not be super obvious picks for most people. So hopefully we can lay it out to you guys and just have a good time talking about it. The first vampire film on our list here is a great example of the kind of shit I was talking about, where, it maybe fails on the, having a memorable cast level of it, but it succeeds with, generating cool atmosphere, having cool effects, and doing something genuinely different with the idea of vampires and the lore. And that is George Romero's Martin from 1977. This also just happens to be my favorite vampire flick of all time. So we're starting the list on a strong note, because I just organized these by release year. And so Martin just happened to be the oldest movie, and it just also happens to be my favorite. So here, let's check out this delicious 35 millimeter trailer scan of Martin from 1977, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it.
My name is Martin. I'm 84 years old. People think I'm crazy when I tell them how old I am. I'd like to be normal. I just have a sickness.
Martin, another kind of terror.
You see, people don't understand what's wrong. They think that I'm a monster. They think I'm a vampire. People don't realize that those things they see in the movies are not real.
Martin.
I would like to be like everyone else.
From the director of Night of the Living Dead. Martin. Another kind of terror.
That trailer doesn't exactly do a great job of putting across the whole mood and vibe of Martin, but essentially you've got a kid that moves from somewhere overseas, I think, in with his superstitious uncle here in the States, presumably. I think it is actually supposed to be here in the States. It's been a little while since I've watched it, so, and the location's really kind of irrelevant. But this kid moves in with his superstitious old Transylvanian uncle or whatever, and he believes him to be a vampire. You're never really sure through the movie whether or not Martin is just a deranged serial killer that believes himself to be a vampire, or if he actually is 80-something years old and dependent on suckling people's blood to, survive. And basically what he does is he goes around and incapacitates them or drugs them, and then uses like a syringe and a razor blade as his main, weapons of blood sucking. And he incapacitates them with drugs and slits their wrists and sucks their blood. That's pretty much, the gist of it. It's got Tom Savini effects up in there, and obviously George Romero directing. And it might not be his most technically proficient film, but I think it does a really good job of kind of doing like a throwback to the vibe of more classic vampire movies from like before the 70s. But then it does something totally unique with the idea of the vampire lore, and that this isn't actually, there's no physical characteristics. As far as we know, Martin can go out in the daylight and do whatever. He just might be immortal and dependent on sucking humans' blood, or he's a fucking serial killer. And I think that that's pretty goddamn cool. Now, I might not have done the best job of explaining why I've generally find like the classic vampire stuff or a lot of the modern tropey vampire stuff boring in the intro to this. Really what it boils down to is there's a lot of vampire movies that came out between like the 30s and the 70s or whatever. And if you watch a couple of those, for the most part, you've seen them all. I mean, they all just kind of do exactly the same thing over and over again in various languages with various people. And it's just sort of the same shit, but then you get something like Martin that's totally unique in the mix and kind of changes what you can do with vampires as a storytelling device, and that might make me sound super pretentious that I'm like, oh, it's nothing original about these vampire movies. I mean, those classic ones can be a lot of fun, and there's plenty of them that I love, but there's a lot of them that are just kind of the same old generic vampire shit recycled, up to and including shit like Salem's Lot. Even though I like that movie a lot, it is kind of that shit. Doesn't really do anything particularly interesting with it. But Martin is a very unique take on vampires. And I think it deserves a lot more love than it gets. You know, Romero tends to be looked at as that dude who did the Dead movies, you know, but he's got a lot of other solid films, and I think Martin is right there at the top of the heap. I probably like it a little bit more than I like The Crazies. Obviously, more than I like shit like Knight Rider and stuff like that, or Knight Riders, excuse me, though that is a fun one. But yeah, it's just I love Martin because it's so unique. It kind of takes away a lot of the goofy stuff that's attached to vampires and replaces it with a bit of realism and a sinister sort of Night Stalkery, Richard Trent Chase, like true crime vibe to it that just makes it something special. You know, you could buy there being somebody like that in the real world, because there has been several actual murderers that were convinced that they had to drink human blood. So no matter which way you swing it, it could be real. You know, if you want to look at it as he is a legit vampire, well, it's a legit vampire without all of the theatrical elements thrown on top of it. He's just a dude that might get real sickly if he doesn't drink human blood. So I think Martin is super fucking unique, and it is my favorite vampire movie just ever, because when I saw that as a teenager, it absolutely blew my mind. You know, I'd seen a lot of the movies that are going to show up later on this list even before I'd seen Martin, and I love them, but I'd never seen anything that really went that far in the direction of like doing something truly odd and weird with the vampire gimmick. And I definitely was not disappointed with that first viewing of Martin. So now we're going to dive into, I guess, you know, modern vampire films of the 80s. That's really the decade where vampire films, I think, became something that you couldn't easily compare, or at least say is a 1-for-1 take from a lot of the shit that was happening back in the classic era of horror films, the 30s, the 40s, yada yada. Even something like Martin, again, it tries to capture a lot of that same atmosphere. It's just doing something different with the gimmick. Our next film is something that I think truly, along with the one that will follow it, brought vampires into the 80s in a way that there would never be any going back from. And that, of course, is the motherfucking Lost Boys, baby. You can't have a list of best vampire movies without this absolute gem on there.
Michael and Sam have just moved to Santa Carla, California. They're about to discover its secret.
Notice anything unusual about Santa Carla yet?
No. It's a pretty cool place. If you're a Martian.
Or a vampire.
So where are you? The flying nun?
I'm your brother, Sammy. Help me!
Stay back! Stay back!
What's happening to me, Star?
Get yourself a good sharp steak. Drive it right through his heart.
You're a vampire, Michael. My own brother, a damn blood-sucking vampire. Oh, you wait till Mom finds out, buddy.
When a vampire buys it, it's never a pretty sight.
Michael, they're coming! Oh, shit!
All right, apologies for the momentary appearance of my clone there. I actually forgot to upload the poster for the movie that was supposed to precede The Lost Boys. So we kind of had to do this slightly out of order, but it's not a huge deal. Really, our next film is the one that I think truly sort of bridges the gap, though, from classic vampire films to The Lost Boys. You'll understand once we get there. Lost Boys is the perfect 80s vampire movie to me. You know, it's got everything that you want. Dudes in yet leather jackets, kids hanging out on boardwalks, buff guys playing saxophone, awesome fucking bleach blonde mullets. It's just kick ass. You know, you've got Corey Feldman up in there. You've got comic book references. You've got some pretty fucking cool vampire effects. An absolutely bitchin' soundtrack that would change my taste in music forever when I heard it as a kid. I've just loved this movie from the first time that I ever saw it at my uncle's house, and none of that has ever changed or diminished with time. Lost Boys is an absolute delight. That being said, it doesn't do anything particularly unique with the vampire gimmick. You know, it's not like a Martin where they really went and took some pains to do something new and different, because they didn't need to. They made all the other criteria of being an awesome vampire movie, which is an absolutely fucking kick-ass cast of memorable characters, awesome fucking atmosphere, cool effects, and just rad fucking fashion, I guess. Is, you know, vampires have been fashion icons of horror for a long time, and I think that that's very present in this movie as well. It's just kick-ass. I mean, there's nothing bad that I've ever been able to come up with to say about The Lost Boys, and I don't think that there ever will be. I mean, the movie's maybe not perfect on a technical level. There's some of the effects that haven't aged the greatest, but they still look good. They still look like solid 80s effects. The movie definitely has a style and an atmosphere about it that can't be denied. I think it's one of those things that slaps you right in the face the moment that you fire the thing up, and it just really doesn't let up through the entire thing. Whereas our next film that we're going to talk about, the one that was supposed to precede Lost Boys on the list here, is very much more of like a throwback to the classic vampire movies. Like I said, it kind of perfectly bridges the gap between the 70s and everything that came from classic eras of horror before that with the 80s. And that, of course, is Fright Night.
What would you do if you accidentally discovered the house next door was occupied by something not human? Something horrifying. Something unspeakably evil. No one believes you.
Mom, I didn't have a nightmare.
Not your mom.
They did kill a girl over there.
Not your girlfriend.
Charlie, is this some sort of a trick to get me back?
Not even the police.
Look, I know it's crazy. I know that, but look, Lieutenant!
It knows that you know. You'll do anything to protect yourself, but it will do anything to protect its secret. Fright Night. If you love being scared, this could be the night of your life. Fright Night. Coming to your neighborhood this summer.
Weird wipe graphic was at the end of that trailer, but it was an eyesore. Fright Night fucking rules. You know, I stand by everything I said about it. I think it's the perfect movie to bridge the gap from the classic sort of black and white era of vampire movies and horror films to the 80s, which at the time obviously was the contemporary era. Unlike The Lost Boys, it doesn't drip with that 80s like atmosphere and vibes. It has a very much more like timeless thing to it, I think, with Fright Night. You could almost place that in modern times and it kind of works. They pretty much did that with the remake or whatever. But the first film is just perfect because it's also so relatable. Like every kid that was ever into scary movies can put themselves in the position of Charlie Brewster and kind of imagine what they might do or how they might handle it if a vampire moved in next door, or any kind of like horror movie critter, you know. The fact that they have him teaming up with sort of a washed up horror movie host from back in the day does a good job of tying it to that era and also showcasing how someone from that era might react to more modern vampires and horror situations. And it's just awesome. It does lack in the soundtrack department. It does lack a bit in the atmosphere department. Fright Night feels a lot less. How do I put it? Fright Night feels like it was going for, just the classic horror vibes, the classic horror atmosphere. It wasn't trying to make it have that 80s flavor to it, so it very much just comes across as like an ode to that stuff that happens to take place in the 80s. And that works. I don't think if there was a bunch of Doors songs on the soundtrack or buff dudes playing saxophone, that Fright Night would be a better movie for it. I think it's pretty rad that they chose to like make it a nostalgia fest without directly nodding to any specific past vampire movies or anything like that. Like now, if they did something like this, I feel like it would be a modern reboot or a sequel to some old vampire movie that happened, and they would constantly be specifically referencing specific vampire movies in it. But Fright Night kind of just exists in its own little what if universe. Instead of making somebody like a parody version of an actual existing horror host, they invent Peter Vincent or whatever for it. And they very much make it like just that general scenario movie of what if a vampire moved in next door to this young horror nerd, I love it. It's one of those vampire movies that I tend to show, like, especially kids that I'm trying to get into watching older horror films. The Lost Boys might not be high on that list. I mean, I think that appeals to you a little bit more if you're like a teenager or an adult. Don't get me wrong, I loved it as a kid as well, but Fright Night's immediately that thing that you can identify with. So I think it's maybe my vote for the most relatable vampire movie ever. And it is a great relic of the 80s. I mean, it's got all those 80s effects. It does have a pretty fun cast of memorable characters. And, it really doesn't do anything interesting with the vampire gimmick, but it doesn't need to. Much like Lost Boys, it does exactly what it's trying to do, in that way that you don't really care that they're not reinventing the wheel with the vampires, because it doesn't always need to be done, unless you have like a good idea. I would rather them do something, I guess, like Fright Night or the Lost Boys, where it hits the marks in all the other areas and just has solid, classic vampire action in it. So disturbing lack of bleach blonde mullets in this film. They should have taken some cues. Well, I guess Lost Boys didn't come out for another 2 years, so they couldn't really ape that yet. But I'm sure bleach blonde mullets were out in 85. So missed opportunity there. Anyways, our next film, I think, does something very unique. It's the most unique film on our list here since Martin. And that is also from 1987, Near Dark. I believe directed by Catherine Bigelow. So let's give this a look, and we'll talk a little bit more about it.
Separate your head from your shoulders.
Do it fast.
All right.
Good times roll. Woo! No! You might as well just kill me then, too.
Caleb Colton no longer belongs to our world.
We'll give him a week to see if we can call him one of us.
He belongs to hers.
But you have to learn to kill.
He belongs to theirs.
I don't want to kill.
He makes you kill tonight.
And they all belong to the night.
It's 3 hours short for a bus ticket home. You help me out?
What are you on?
Believe me, I told you.
Just don't think of it as killing. Evening. Don't think at all. It's just something that you do night after night. It's only ever a question of how.
You nervous? I would be too if I were you.
Near Dark.
The bigger boys fall in with control. Check out time.
some time, son.
God damn, this is my family. Let him go.
Near dark. Pray for daylight. The night has its price.
And there it is, folks. Near Dark. Near Dark, sadly, is not a film like Lost Boys or Fright Night that I saw as a young lad, and I definitely feel a bit deprived on account of that. I do remember seeing it at a video store once, but for whatever reason, our local video joint never had a copy of it that I was aware of. So I didn't end up seeing Near Dark until like last year of middle school or one of the first couple of years of high school. But I immediately fell in love with that shit. It kind of takes, well, I mean, first and foremost, it's basically an Aliens reunion, and I was a huge fan of Aliens and still am. So naturally that drew me in right away. Like, holy shit, you know, we got half of the main cast of Alien in this thing, or Aliens, excuse me. But outside of that, Near Dark does something really cool with the vampire gimmick. Instead of it just being like a creepy dude in his lair that woos in some young girl or something like that, the gender roles are kind of flipped. In this, it's like literally a cowboy dude who you would normally think of as being kind of macho that gets sucked into this on account of a female that he meets, and, you know, gets embroiled in this whole crazy situation with this sort of Texas Chainsaw Massacre-esque family of roving fucking gypsy vampires, basically. I don't think we're supposed to say gypsies anymore. Whoops. But, you know, they roam around the countryside in this crazy Winnebago with like blacked out windows, just feasting on fools. I mean, it's got a sweaty, dusty, like modern sort of Western vibe to the whole thing. It's got those road trip vibes in there too, on account of the fact that, you know, they're running around in their Winnebago and shit. It's got some solid effects, just again, great atmosphere on account of the weird, dusty, sweaty vibes. I can't say enough good things about Near Dark, and again, the cast is phenomenal. It lacks a bit in the soundtrack department for my taste, but that's not to say that it's bad. I just think it's a fresh new take on the whole thing, you know, and a fresh new take on it that would be borrowed from several times from movies on our list and just throughout vampire film history since then, you know. I can't recall a movie prior to Near Dark that featured like a traveling gang of vampires. They're essentially like, you know, a wild bunch. That might not be right. I don't think the dudes in the Wild Bunch were as sadistic or fucking crazy as these guys. They're a roving gang of bandits. You know, if this movie was set back in the cowboy days and they were on horses instead of in a Winnebago, well, a lot of the gimmick wouldn't work because they would just fry the first time they were forced to travel in daylight. But they could hop from caves to caves. The movie would be a lot less exciting, but it could work, is what I'm saying. And the family dynamic of it isn't that far off from like a Texas Chainsaw Massacre kind of a thing. I guess Bill Paxton would basically be the Leatherface of the movie because he's fucking going absolutely ape shit the entire time. But I don't know, man. I mean, it's got a part where a dude gets his throat slit with some spurs, which I've never seen in any other fucking, like, even, you know, period accurate Western movie. So cheers to Catherine Bigelow and the people in Near Dark for putting that together. And, you know, it's the first vampire movie that I remember being consciously aware of the sort of the parallels between the vampire curse, or whatever you want to call it, and drug addiction. As you saw in the trailer, there's even a point where he's being accused of being a junkie, pretty much. And I'm sure, you know, like other stuff kind of had elements of that in there. Martin, which I would see later on, definitely has that in there. I mean, you could look at Martin as a junkie. I think the syringe being a main device in there and him drugging the people is supposed to kind of immediately draw your mind to that. But Near Dark is like the next example I can think of that, where vampires were treated as kind of almost addicts in a way. I also really love the idea that you could just give someone a complete blood transfusion and eventually weed out whatever vampire virus is in them. You kind of got to couple that with like exposing them to sunlight, if I remember right. Actually, that might be from Daybreakers, which we'll talk about later. Near Dark fucking rules, though. If you want to see an awesome 80s vampire flick with rad effects, rad atmosphere, a memorable cast of characters that you're going to definitely remember, especially if you've seen Aliens, and kind of cool gender swap shit going on with the typical tropes of the vampires and the ones they entrap or whatever, Near Dark is definitely one that needs to be on your list. And that kind of does it for, the 70s and 80s vampire flicks for our run here. We're going to take a absolute fucking cannonball right into the glorious 90s, because, man, was it a good decade for vampire movies. And we're going to kick it off with, of course, Bram Stoker's Dracula. This is a movie that I maybe didn't appreciate at the time for reasons we'll talk about after we run the trailer here, but I've since came around to just being deeply in love with it. It's a fantastic tour de force, as they would say, of special effects and horror atmosphere and powerhouse fucking performances from a very memorable cast. So let's run that trailer, and then we'll talk a little bit about why maybe it took me a while to come around to this flick.
Here occurred the frightening and shocking history of Prince Dracula and the woman he loved.
I have crossed oceans of time to find you.
Ja, Dracula.
There's a sinister, darker side to him I find irresistible. I have never met any man with such a passion for life. He is unlike any man. What are you?
Vampires do exist. This one we fight, this one we face, can take on many forms. He is both young and old. He can appear as mist, as vapor, as the fog. And he can vanish at will.
My love.
The power of his evil desire has no end.
You've got to go to him, and you've got to love him.
She is a willing recruit and devoted disciple. She is the devil's concubine.
Join me in eternal life.
Your salvation is his destruction.
I want to be what you are. I want to see what you see. I want to love what you love. Take me away from all this death.
Make no mistake, he must be stopped.
I don't know what else to... Well, I know what else to say about it, but there's nothing bad I can say about that, honestly. At the time, all right, I had the same reaction to the movie that everybody who doesn't like has to it. And that is, what the fuck is up with old man Dracula's hair? It's like a cross between Princess Leia and that Sir Mix-a-Lot video. You all know the one. But I guess that was a somewhat popular hairstyle for people from his century or whatever. I don't know. It's pretty whack. But once you can, remove yourself from focusing on that lame hair, which really isn't even in the movie that much, you can sort of appreciate the fact that the cast is fucking perfect. I mean, Gary Oldman as Dracula cannot be messed with. No matter which version of Dracula he's playing in that movie, he absolutely kills it because it's Gary fucking Oldman. Winona Ryder gives an absolute powerhouse performance, possibly, maybe in my opinion, the best of her career. Even Keanu Reeves is fucking good in it. And let's be honest, as beloved as Keanu Reeves is, he's never been a great actor, but you totally buy him in this movie as the character that he's portraying. You got that feller from Liar Liar up in there as well. I always forget his name. He's pretty decent in it. Obviously, Anthony Hopkins is fucking slaying it the entire time in more ways than one. And then visually, the movie is perfect. Somehow, and this kind of harkens back to comments I've made prior in this stream already, which is that if you're not going to do something unique or different with the vampire thing, then you need to bring the atmosphere, you need to bring the cast, you need to do the classic vampire shit, but do it as good as you possibly can with what you have in the time period that you're doing it. And I think Bram Stoker's Dracula is just, in terms of filmmaking and special effects, set design, camera trickery, cinematography in general, it's an absolute fucking perfect specimen of 90s horror. If we were going to sit there and measure movies just on technical aspects, it might be the best horror film of the 90s. I mean, it is a massive movie in terms of effects and everything I just listed. I'm not going to be a broken record right now, but the movie is fucking phenomenal on a technical level. And then it's equally backed up by great performances from the cast and a pretty proper retelling of the Dracula story. I'm no expert on it by any means, but I've done a couple of different podcasts as a guest for Bram Stoker's Dracula over the years and heard from people that are a lot more learned on it than I. And from what I can tell, it's a good amalgamation of like the Dracula story and then actual Vlad the Impaler facts. So they managed to meld the two in a way that's very convincing, especially with Gary Oldman's portrayal of the character. So yeah, Bram Stoker's Dracula has to be on your list if you're going to do a best of the Bloodsuckers kind of thing like we're doing right now. Any others, even some Full Moon shit up in there, because the suit from their Beastman sex film that they made, that's also a ghost story, Meridian, makes an appearance in there. It's the Wolfman Dracula suit, which is pretty fucking cool. So the suit was good enough for Bram Stoker's Dracula. It was definitely good enough for Meridian. It looks amazing. And there's people I probably left off the list that deserve nods for their performances in it. This isn't a fucking Bram Stoker's Dracula review, but it definitely needs to be shown some appreciation on this list. I wish that I appreciated it more as a kid. I got to be honest. When I watched it back then, I might have turned it off shortly after seeing what Dracula looked like. You have this preconceived version of Dracula in your mind from, obviously Bela Lugosi, and then seeing dudes like Christopher Lee portray him, which they look drastically different from each other, but the general style of the character isn't far off, and then you see him in shit like Monster Squad, which I'd definitely seen before this. Real hard not to include that as a best vampire movie, because Dracula is a big fucking deal in that movie, but it's not strictly a vampire movie. But point is, even Count fucking Chocula, the Count from Sesame Street, you have a preconceived version of Dracula in your mind. And then when you see the fucking I like big butts fucking wig that he's wearing, it's a little hard to take seriously, So I don't know that I ever actually saw this in its entirety until much later. But I've appreciated it pretty much ever since. And especially with recent viewings of it in the last 2-3 years, I just fall more in love with this thing every time I look at it. Even that trailer gave me fucking goosebumps and made me want to watch the movie again. So that's enough Dracula worship. It's time to move on to the other best fucking vampire film of the early 90s. and that's that Buffy the Vampire Slayer, baby. You also cannot have a best of the Bloodsuckers list without this absolute fucking gem right here.
I just met this girl named Buffy. I'm Pike.
Pike isn't a name, it's a fish.
I liked her even though she seemed kind of flaky. But as it turns out...
You have been chosen, Buffy,
Do what?
to stop the vampires.
Does Elvis talk to you?
And things started getting weird around here.
Are we having a nightmare?
You threw a knife at my head.
And you caught it.
She was the one person I could really count on.
Kill him a lot.
Hi.
Hi. What are you doing here?
What am I doing here? I'm saving your butt. That is a bad guy. Can we go, please?
The Slayer is unmasked. Let's finish it.
I think this relationship has potential.
Hi. How's it going?
You're obviously having a bad hair day.
If she can just get rid of those other guys in her life.
Stab him in the heart.
Christy Swanson.
I am so sure.
Donald Sutherland. Paul Rubens. With Rutger Hauer and Luke Perry.
Buffy, you're not like other girls.
Yes, I am.
Buffy, the Vampire Slayer.
I didn't even break a nail.
Directed by Fran Rubel Kazooie.
There it is, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. This is a film that I think tragically got overshadowed by a television show, and I can understand that. I'm a big fan of the Buffy TV series as well, always will be. But I think that there's a lot of things that the movie does better. The movie is a much better tribute to classic vampire films. At this point, the classic vampire stuff from like the vintage age of Bela Lugosi all the way through to the 90s, you know, because there's definitely some of that 80s style in this, being as it was only like 1992 or whatever. And so there's nods to that stuff. There's nods to the classic stuff. You've got an impeccable cast in this. It does something, I think, very, you know, unique with the vampire gimmick. And that's instead of, you know, dabbling with horror comedy like Fright Night does, this is a straight up like teenage high school rom-com that you might have seen in the 80s, but done through a vampire movie filter. You know, like it's got that vampire shit laid on top of that classic sort of John Hughes romantic comedy type thing. I think with more of a 90s flair to it. In a lot of ways, I do feel like Buffy the Vampire Slayer set the tone for some of those, like, I don't know what you'd call them, like quirky, edgy teenage rom-coms that you would see throughout the 90s. And then eventually that all got tamed out of it and we get shit like Dawson's Creek. But Buffy, you know, is as much, I think, an integral part of the evolution of the teen comedy as it is the evolution of vampire films. There was definitely like comedy vampire movies before this, but Buffy caught on in a way. You know, it didn't ever get as popular as the show got because the show totally fucking eclipsed it, but it was definitely a cult hit. And I think it popularized the idea of a straight up vampire comedy. You know, there's not a lot of true, like legit horror in Buffy. There's a lot of stuff paying homage to legit horror. You got Paul Rubens as one of the main vampires. I mean, Pee Wee fucking Herman. So that's rad. I think it's fucking glorious that they went the full 9 yards with it instead of doing kind of the Fright Night thing where it's meant to be a legit horror film that has a sprinkling of comedy in it. And I don't know. I think it's a shame that we didn't get like a sequel to this movie, or maybe even a couple of sequels to it before they launched the show. The show's great in its own way, but Buffy the movie in a lot of ways, like I said, I think is superior. And it opened the doors for I guess a lot of fucking horror comedies in general to be more overtly comedies. You know, I think a lot of stuff skirted the line. I think that we definitely had straight up horror comedies before this, but again, Buffy kind of brought it, I guess, a little bit more mainstream to do that kind of thing. And I'm not saying any of the movies that spawned from it are good, but it certainly influenced films that came after it, I think. As a film itself, though, just great fun. You know, it's not to be taken as seriously as, you know, Bram Stoker's Dracula. But I think it's cool that the 90s, at least for me, with vampire movies, it has those two back to back. You know, the yin and the yang. You got the serious, old school, classic gothic vampire shit with Bram Stoker's Dracula. And then you have the like sort of bubblegum high school fucking dorky teen comedy version of it with Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And, you know, honestly, I think Donald Sutherland as, you know, her mentor in the film is a role that he does not get enough credit for. I mean, it's comedic, but at the same time, you could also totally buy that guy in a movie like Bram Stoker's Dracula or something, you know, more serious. So kudos to the Sutherlands. That's two Sutherlands that made our list for volume 1 here. We are actually going to put a pin in this. We're going to be rolling right out here in like 15 minutes with volume 2. But I did want to break these up so that they're a little easier for people to come and watch. You know, if it's 2 hours, 2.5 hours, it's a little more intimidating to dive into. But this has been the first 6-pack of our Best of the Bloodsuckers event here to celebrate Dead and Lovely and all the things they've done for horror movie reviews and awesome podcasting and their No Vampire event. Highly recommend you guys go back through their playlists and just listen to every vampire movie review that they've ever done, because they're all fucking hilarious. But we're going to dive into this, you know, next volume with some of the later 90s stuff, some of the early 2000s stuff. And our list pretty much ends right around 2016, which I think was the last time a vampire movie was made that I actually watched or had any interest in. So, again, I'm not a huge fan of this shit, but I like some quality vampire flicks, and hopefully some of the stuff in our next volume will be a little less obvious and maybe encourage some of you guys to finally get out there and give it a look. As always, check out all of our affiliated links, not least of which is Dead and Lovely, in the description below. And we will see you back here like literally in 10 to 15 minutes with volume 2.